Greetings and welcome to Kansas's Bob Dole in American Life. I'm Bob Beatty. In 1980, Kansas Senator Bob Dole was asked who he would list as the most effective leaders in history. One that he named was fellow Kansan President Dwight D. Eisenhower, because Eisenhower not only did great things for his state and country, but his leadership touched the world. And the same could be said for Senator Bob Dole. One example. A few years ago, I was visiting the small, relatively new Balkan country of Kosovo. I was standing on a street corner in the capital, Pristina, and I looked up at the street sign. I was standing on Robert Dole Street. From Kansas to Kosovo and places in between, Bob Dole's impact was monumental. Bob Dole's idea was never to be a political figure and statesman. His plan was to be a college athlete and then a doctor. But everything changed when he went to fight in World War II and he was grievously wounded. Here is a clip from his own 1974 U.S. Senate TV ad explaining that.
We want you to take a long, hard look at Senator Bob Dole. We'll start with what comes naturally to the average politician, shaking hands. To most men in public office, it's a way of life. To Bob Dole, it doesn't come easy. Not since the day he lost the use of his right hand. It hasn't always been that way. Bob Dole not only shook hands when he was a kid, but won numerous sports letters and awards. He fought his first battles on the fields of Russell High, moved on to the University of Kansas, where as a pre-med student, he won his letters in basketball and football. But then the war broke out. Bob Dole signed up. He was 20. At Camp Breckenridge, he weighed in at a trim 192 pounds. But then one cold morning, as he was leading his platoon against a German machine gun emplacement, he left his shell hole to save a wounded radio man. The machine gun and fragment wounds he received cost him 39 months in Army hospitals. They gave him the Bronze Star with cluster, but they couldn't give him back the use of his right hand.
So, Bob Dole's plans changed, and he ended up not only becoming the majority leader of the United States Senate, but the Republican nominee for president in 1996. Joining us now to talk about Bob Dole is Ambassador Sam Brownback, who served Kansas as governor and also in the U.S. Senate before becoming U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom in 2018. Ambassador Brownback, obviously many people serve in Congress. Bob Dole became iconic. What made him so unique?
I think what made him unique was he really embodied the World War II generation, the greatest generation. Comes from a hard scramble situation in Russell, Kansas, goes off to war, serves his country valiantly, gets wounded in combat, fights back from that, and he represents what that generation was. Hardworking, not asking for anything, giving to their own country, standing for America, deep patriotism, wanting to build this country up. He just really embodied all of it. And then this real self-deprecating sense of humor that all of us remember. He was just the funniest guy on top of a legendary political and world leader. I've been on that street in Pristina, and I've talked to the leaders of Kosovo, and they recognize Bob Dole. This country wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Bob Dole.
You know, I really wasn't kidding about that. I was just standing on the street, being from Topeka, Kansas, in Kosovo, looked up and it said Robert Dole Street. And I was like, wow, what a person to be able to have that happen.
Yeah, and they remember that, and he had that sort of impact in a lot of places. Americans with Disability Act was one of his hallmark pieces of legislation, along with a number of farm bills and food aid program. The Dole-McGovern food aid program has kept probably billions of people alive around the world.
Let's take a look at a clip from the unveiling of the Bob Dole statue at Washburn University.
I mean, I believed in bipartisanship. We don't have all the wisdom in our party, and they don't have all the wisdom in their party, but together we can work out a pretty good compromise. And we did, time after time after time, because of our friendship just with our colleagues. We didn't wear our buttons for Republican.
Is that something that you saw him over the years, that what he talks about this is being able to work with all sorts of people?
He did do that, and really amazingly so. A lot of it was built around relationships, and that's the sort of thing that unfortunately there aren't as many across the aisle that have relationships, but life moves at the speed of relationship. I heard a guy say that in a sermon the other day, and I thought how true that is. And then that becomes the fault line in a lot of politics now, is we don't have those relationships across the aisle, and so it makes it very hard to move things. But he did, and you know, again, that sort of sense of humor and that Midwestern get things done, that Eisenhower way of, I don't care who gets the credit, let's get it done, is what I'm concerned about, really served him well in doing so many things.
Well, that's an interesting point. How do you think he was able to build these relationships? Because we've seen in politics, some people, you know, sort of offend the other side and then they won't talk to each other, or they say things through the media. But clearly Bob Dole was able to establish bonds with Democrats, obviously, and all sorts of people. So even though he was very partisan, he could be, he still was able to work with them. How did he do that?
You know, I think it was an era where people would divide on politics but not on personality. So I don't agree with you, but that doesn't matter on this policy issue that both of us care about. Whereas now it seems like it's divided more into the personality. I don't agree with you and I don't like you. And you can't do anything then. I did Senate bills with Paul Wellstone, who at the time was one of the most liberal members in the Senate. We did a human trafficking bill. I don't agree with Paul Wellstone, didn't. He's a wonderful gentleman, unfortunately died in a plane crash, but we could agree on this topic. And you really saw Bob Dole take that art to perfection.
I read where you said you had to convince sometimes Republicans that Bob Dole was conservative, and he was conservative. Did they think he wasn't because he was working with so many different people?
No, I don't think it was that. I just think at the time, because he was majority leader and had been in leadership so long, often leadership has to try to get the trains to move. And so he would take some policy positions that he didn't really agree with, but we need this for the good of the country. And at his core, he was a patriot. He is a patriot. He believes in America, and he's willing to fight for America and do whatever it takes to keep this country moving forward.
What's your lasting memory of Bob Dole? Or you may have several, but one that really sticks out. Really, he is the embodiment of the World War II generation. That selfless, willing to give and sacrifice everything for the common good. That's really my lasting memory of him. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador Brownback. And when we come back, we'll have more of Kansas's Bob Dole in American Life.
Of course, you make those on a daily basis, but it would seem to me, as I look back over my lifetime and look at the key decisions I made that became building blocks in a career that I hope has been a useful one, and one which I've been able to display leadership and compassion and commitment and confidence, are based on the way I was raised by my mother and father, the fact that I worked for nearly everything I have, and it's been I believe, to some measure, a success story. This is home for me, my family, people I grew up with and worked with, people who helped me get back on my feet again after the war. I owe them a lot. That's why I'm so proud to be their United States Senator, voicing their hopes and dreams for their families, their community, their nation. It's a great job working for Kansas every day.
Bob Dole. He's our senator.
Welcome back to Kansas's Bob Dole and American Life. Bob Dole spent 27 years in the U.S. Senate, including 5 years as Majority Leader. While he worked on thousands of pieces of legislation, several stand out because of how many lives they touched and also how he used his skills to make them work. They are the Food Stamps Reform Act of 1977, Social Security Reform in 1983, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Joining me to explore Bob Dole's role in these signature acts is Dr. Amber Dickinson from Washburn University. Dr. Dickinson, thanks for being here. I'd like to start with the Food Stamps Act. What was that and what was Bob Dole's role in that?
So basically, when you look at the trajectory of Bob Dole's career, he was always concerned about this issue of hunger. And so this was an attempt to deal with the food stamp program and make some changes to that would make it more accessible, but also would work to alleviate some of taxpayers' concern over waste in the system. So together with Senator McGovern, they created this bipartisan piece of legislation that did a couple of things to address those concerns. The first was to eliminate a pre-existing dollar amount that you had to pay to even get access to food stamps in the first place. And that was, of course, really difficult for a lot of low-income families to make that minimum payment to have access to the food stamps. So the legislation eliminated that. But then, of course, to address those concerns over potential waste in this program, the act also did things like said, look, if you're the head of the household and you're the main income earner for this household and then you quit your job to apply for food stamps, you're not really eligible for this program. And I think that was a political mechanism to ensure longevity of the food stamp program.
That's interesting. Let's move on to Social Security now. By the early 1980s, Social Security was sort of in big trouble, and yet Bob Dole gets credit for helping to save Social Security. Tell us about that.
So President Reagan tasked Alan Greenspan with doing some research on the potential for longevity of this program. And then Greenspan was to make a report to this committee in Congress that was dealing with this issue. Now, the Congressional Committee was really rife with conflict. So they had some people that were concerned that this was not even an issue to begin with, that this idea of a crisis was being overblown. And then, of course, you had people that were concerned about raising taxes. There were some people that thought perhaps there should just be a reduction in benefits. And Senator Dole, of course, was concerned about the idea of reduction in benefits. And so he had published this article in the New York Times that got the attention of another senator, and together they created this bipartisan proposal to do things like put this on a payroll tax to create a funding mechanism for Social Security, but then also to encourage Congress to engage in spending reform to make sure that this didn't go away because of overspending in other areas.
And finally, there's the Americans for Disabilities Act, his sort of one of his signature programs. He's well known for that. What was his role in that act?
Well, he was a huge advocate for people with disabilities, in large part because he was a World War II veteran who had sustained injuries that left him pretty unable to use his right arm for the most part. And so he was always this champion for disabilities, and he even did things like created a foundation that was to connect people with disabilities to employment opportunities. And so as Senate Minority Leader, he was really responsible for creating a lot of discussions and conversations that were to persuade people who were really opposed to this piece of legislation. Even though it's a major civil rights piece of legislation, people were concerned that it was going to cost so much money for businesses to comply with what the ADA was calling for, that people were really opposed to it. And Senator Dole was really responsible for creating these conversations that encouraged people to end up voting for the bill.
Now, there's a theme in your discussion here about Bob Dole is that he's a Republican, but he's working with Democrats, working with interest groups, and at the end of the day, getting these things passed. So he must have had some pretty good skills at negotiation, but also being willing to compromise.
I think yes, absolutely. I also think his conviction towards these issues was probably what was really convincing for a lot of the people that he worked with. His first speech on the floor in 1968 was talking about protecting the rights of people with disabilities. And so he has this long-term reputation of picking things that he wants to advocate for and sticking with them for the entirety of his career.
Thank you so much for helping us understand this. We'll take a short break and return for more of Kansas's Bob Dole and American Life.
Tonight, I want to express my deep appreciation to Senator Dole for the indispensable role that he has played in all of this. His leadership in the Senate, his strong hand, and his responsible voice have made a difference. He's forged a tough working alliance between the Senate and the executive branch. And Bob, from the heart, I thank you.
A tested man, a proven leader for President Bob Dole.
Steps forward, ready to lead.
Steady leadership for someone who's made tough decisions, for someone who's been a mainstream conservative for a long, long time, for someone who knows what made America great.
Tested in war, proven in peace, Bob Dole embodies the strength of America. A man every American will be proud to call president.
Welcome back to Kansas's Bob Dole and American Life. Remarkably, Bob Dole ran for the White House 4 times. He was the Republican nominee for vice president in 1976, ran in the Republican primaries in 1980 and 1988, and won the Republican nomination in 1996 and lost to Bill Clinton in that final race. Joining us to talk about Bob Dole as a national figure is Dr. Burdett Loomis from the University of Kansas. Dr. Loomis is one of the preeminent scholars on Bob Dole, and most recently wrote a chapter on Senator Dole for the book Leadership in the U.S. Senate. Dr. Loomis, usually American politicians only get a couple bites of the presidential apple, but Bob Dole got quite a few. How was he able to do this?
I think, for one thing, I think you have to start with Bob Dole's considerable ambition. You go back to the origin story of working late at night, becomes a House member, becomes a senator. He wanted to get ahead. He had that work ethic combined with ambition. So I think you start there. You don't do that, you don't run by accident. Secondly, in terms of 1976, he was almost an accidental candidate. We can talk a little more about that. But he had been the head of the Republican National Committee. He'd been a moderately prominent, but certainly not super prominent senator. And then I think he got a taste of it then. 1980 was kind of a cup of coffee. He really, but 88 was a very serious run, and obviously 96 was. So he was a national political figure from his days as Republican chair in the early 70s, and then as a very important congressional leader in the 1980s. So he had a long run as a national figure, and he was a familiar one to Republicans.
And he, of course, is the Republican chair when Richard Nixon is president, but he gets picked by Gerald Ford, so he's not tainted by the Nixon experience. Why did Ford pick him to be the vice presidential nominee in 1976?
Really good question. It came at the very end. It was during the convention, and it came down to various people, Senator Baker, some others, and at the end, I think that Ford didn't want to go much onto the campaign trail, and he saw in Dole someone who was this aggressive partisan who could literally be the attack dog. And I say that in the most modest kinds of way, but he was going to be the partisan, the heavy. Jerry Ford, the nice guy, would sit back at the White House. And Dole embraced that role, certainly. And so I think, in many ways, I think Jerry Ford chose him, and his advisors chose him to go out on the campaign trail and be tough-minded for the rest of the campaign, which is exactly what he did. Now, in terms of being tainted by Watergate, actually he and Nixon didn't get along that well. And Dole, as a clever politician, I think saw early on that he did not want to go too far down the road with Nixon. So he never was really identified as being in the Nixon camp, and that certainly helped him in 1976.
Now, Bob Dole had an incredible legislative career, which we'll get to pretty quickly, but do you think being in the Senate for so many years hurt him in running for president? Because when you think about, for example, Barack Obama or George W. Bush, they don't have much legislative experience, whereas Bob Dole had tons of it. Do you think that hurt him when he ran for president?
Here's what I would say, when I came to Kansas and in the early 80s, I remember one of the first columns I wrote was to write about Bob Dole as a potential presidential candidate. And I think my point was that Bob Dole, and I believe this to this day, has a real legislative soul. He is a legislator. He wants to make the deal. He wants to bring people together. He wants to be in the room when it happens and all that. And that's who he is. Now, he's ambitious. He wanted to be president. But in the end, I think he was more comfortable in that legislative role. So I don't think it disqualified him. He got the nomination after all. But honestly, if you looked at in the 96 campaign, he shifts positions, he takes on a different tax position. He had to do that in public. As a legislator, he could do it in private, make the deal. And so I always thought that he was far more comfortable in the chambers of the Senate than running for president.
And you've written a lot about Bob Dole in the Senate, and as I look back on his career, some of the deals he made for signature legislation, it was actually incredible, and maybe nowadays would be tough to do because he would make deals and make compromises. What was it about him that he was able to get these sort of really hard-fought deals on Social Security and other things done?
Well, for one thing, I think it was the times, without any question. When he got to Senate leadership, and that's the Senate Finance Committee for 4 years, then for 11 and a half years as floor leader, either in the majority or the minority, particularly in the 80s, but into the 90s as well. There was more of a spirit of cross-partisanship, deal-making. People could come to the table. And remember, look at the people he's working with. He's working with Tip O'Neill. He's working with Teddy Kennedy. They are legislators. He's working with Pat Moynihan. These are giants. And they could bring people with them, and they all wanted to get a deal done. No, he could not function the way he did in today's Senate, period.
10 seconds, what do you think his signature piece of legislation is in his career?
Personally, I think it's the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I would say saving Social Security and the tax deal, both of those in the 1980s, probably equally important.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Loomis, for your insight, and thanks also to Ambassador Sam Brownback and Dr. Amber Dickinson for joining us as well. As for myself and my thoughts on the life of Bob Dole, I think it best to use Marlene Dietrich's line and simply say, he was some kind of a man. Thank you for joining us.
But it shows that you can come from a small town in America, that you don't need the wealth and all the material things in this world to succeed. If I've succeeded, and some might quarrel with that. But I want to reemphasize, as I did before, if I've done anything, it's because of people I've known up and down Main Street, and I can recall the time when I needed help, the people of Russell helped. And I think